Ms. Bonnie Glaser, Director of the China Power Project Center for Strategic International Studies. And Yang Bahagia Brigadier General Mohazmi bin Maisud, Senior Director of DSA. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, very good morning and welcome to Midas Executive Dialogue, Serial 6, 2019. So before we continue today's presentation, I would like to invite Yang Bahagia Brigadier General Hazmi to say a few words. Yeah.
First of all, I would like to welcome Bonnie Glaser, Prof. Quick, and Dr. Hu, as well as the rest. Big thanks from Lima, I guess, yeah, and the rest of the participants. Thank you for being here. We are very fortunate to have with us Bonnie Glaser from CSIS. And she'll be talking about US-China relations under Trump and Xi. We take this opportunity to have all of you here because of the expertise we have with us. Initially, we're just going to have a roundtable talk, but we changed the modality because of the person that's appearing before us. So we have a mini dialogue, and I'm glad all of you could make yourself present to take advantage of this opportunity. Without further ado, I would like to invite Bonnie Glaser to deliver. Thank you.
Is this on? Yes. It's really a privilege to be here at the Ministry of Defense in KL, and thank you all for coming. I had prepared just something really informal to talk about today, so I apologize that I don't have any slides because I thought that I was just going to have a roundtable discussion and have an opportunity to learn from all of you. I do hope that maybe in the discussion session you can provide me some of your own perspectives as to how you see the United States, China in this region. And as you know, the United States is really looking now more broadly at the Indo-Pacific region. I'll be going here to the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, where, as many of you know, for the first time in 8 years, China is sending its defense minister. Wei Fenghe will be there. The acting defense secretary from the United States, Shanahan, will be there as well, and he will be fleshing out the U.S. approach to the free and open Indo-Pacific. So I wanted to say a few general things about the overall U.S.-China relationship, which I actually see at a fairly dangerous turning point right now, maybe a strategic crossroads. But I will get to that. I want to start by saying that the national security strategy and national defense strategy, which were issued, as you know, in December 2017 and January of 2018, really laid out a new frame for the United States security perspective. And China was defined as a strategic competitor, a rival, and a revisionist power, pretty much put in the same box as Russia, especially in terms of being a revisionist power. And so the goal of the United States is to gradually continue the shift away from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific. But as I'm sure all of you know, this is very challenging for the United States as we continue to be very focused, I think, on the Middle East. And it's not my area of research. I focus on the Indo-Pacific. But China, of course, is a global player, and so I do try to follow what the Chinese are doing everywhere. The Pentagon is quite focused on implementing the national defense strategy. The White House and other parts of the Trump administration are trying to strengthen US competitiveness vis-a-vis China. And this is really becoming a top priority. And you can see this in many areas of the administration. So if you look at our Department of Justice, a China initiative was created that is focusing attention on China's economic espionage. In the State Department, there is a new Global Engagement Center, which was stood up as a result of funding from Congress that is aimed at promoting a more positive US narrative and pushing back against what many see as a negative Chinese narrative that they are putting forward about the United States. So this is all about competition. And the competition is increasingly in many different domains. If we look back over the last particularly 10 years in this region, the competition in the military realm has been clear. The security experts in the United States have been thinking about China, its development of anti-access area denial weapons, its buildup in the South China Sea, its growing military pressure on Taiwan. None of this is new. What's new is the other parts of the competition. In the Obama administration, the approach to China was essentially to seek cooperation where we have converging common interests and to try to manage our differences and even try to narrow them. So there was some importance attached to cooperation with China, and I think most prominent was the cooperation in the climate change realm. But the military relationship was also cooperative to some extent. There was an attempt to try and find areas where we could work together, and we had very important agreement on implementing cues and maintaining safety in the air and at sea, the MOUs that were signed. This has now changed, I think, in the Trump administration. There's still implementation of these agreements, but the focus of the military relationship with China is now on crisis communications, and preventing the risks and potential escalation, avoiding misunderstanding and miscalculation. This is really across the board in the Trump administration. There's just very little interest in cooperation, period. It really is all about competition. I myself think that that's a problem. But that is what I see in the Trump administration. Another major change that I see in the Trump administration's approach is the relationship between our strategy toward China and our free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. So under President Obama, we had we called it the pivot and then the rebalance, and our approach to China fit into that. In the Trump administration, I think it's actually completely reversed. I think that what we have is a FOIP strategy, free and open Indo-Pacific, that is nested inside the China strategy. So the top priority is how are we competing with China? It is not a strategy of fitting China into our broader regional strategy, and that is a shift. We have seen a change in different constituencies in the United States in their view of China, but I am hesitant to say that there is a consensus. So the mainstream has hardened. That's absolutely true. And as I mentioned, the security community, their views toughened toward China really over a decade ago. In our Congress, we have seen a substantial shift towards a toughening of policies and attitudes towards China. Almost on a weekly basis, we are seeing hearings that are held on various aspects of threats that Congress sees from China, ranging from economic threats. I testified a few weeks ago on what's known as the Made in China 2025 program, which is 10 areas of technology that China seeks to essentially dominate in the 21st century. There are hearings on cyber espionage and maritime issues, a whole range of concerns. The biggest change, though, is really in the business community. And I think that there's a lack of appreciation in many places for the importance of the role of the business community in influencing policy. So in the Obama administration, you had many American companies who were having challenges with China, stealing their intellectual property or forcing them to transfer technology in order to participate in joint ventures in China. But they were making profits, and they did not want to confront China. They wanted to deal with their problems quietly, and many of them didn't want the American government helping them, so they would go directly through their channels in China to resolve problems. That has fundamentally changed, and that is something that business leaders in the United States are telling the Chinese, that the US business community has fundamentally come to see what they call an unfair playing field in the economic realm as threatening to them. And making profits is just not enough anymore, and not as many companies are making profits. So if you look at the survey of the annual American Chamber of Commerce, for example, you can see a marked increase in the concerns of the American business community. And they've taken these concerns to President Trump. And so they have become an important part of our policy. So we now have the business community Congress and the security community. On the sort of softer side, what you have is people in academia, universities. Our universities get a lot of tuition money from Chinese students. We also have a lot of smart Chinese students working in American labs, and universities are actually loath to lose this contact with the Chinese. I was just out in San Francisco last week and talked to people from Silicon Valley, and they talk about how artificial intelligence is something that is developed collaboratively. It is not, if the United States actually shuts out China, it will be American companies and innovators who lose, not just the Chinese. So there is really, I think, a reluctance in Silicon Valley to get on board with a much tougher strategy towards China. And then there are states who want Chinese investment, want to work with the Chinese. We actually have some rural areas in the United States who have Huawei equipment and technology, and they don't really support the Trump administration's effort to put a wall that will keep out Huawei. So we actually, I think, continue to have a debate in the United States about what our policies should be. That said, I think that this emphasis on competition is likely to endure. From my perspective, the Trump administration doesn't really have a very clear vision of what kind of relationship it wants with China. That's just my view. You know, we want to get tougher, we want to be competitive, but I'm not clear what the ultimate goal is. There are people who just want a level playing field in trade. I think the president wants to have an even trade relationship, so that we eliminate our deficit, and we have a very substantial trade deficit with China. He's been saying this for decades. This is not a new idea. But we have individuals in the Trump administration who have convinced him that the stealing of intellectual property is also important, and so our USTR Lighthizer continues to make sure that President Trump will demand more than just selling more of American products to China. Others in the administration really seem to want regime change. We had an individual who was at policy planning in the State Department say something a few weeks ago about the clash of civilizations, and she said that this was the first time that the United States has faced an adversary that was Caucasian. Now, this is not historical fact to begin with, but setting that aside, this is a terribly racist, in my view, frame for American foreign policy, and not the way we should think about China. So We've heard our Secretary of State talk about China and express concerns about Chinese policies in Latin America, in the Arctic, in Africa, certainly in the South China Sea, concerned about cooperation with Russia, and the Belt and Road Initiative has gotten a lot of attention. So hard to know what the priorities are. The United States is clearly saying China's just a problem everywhere. Human rights is taking on some importance, especially the camps, and some call them re-education centers. I prefer to call them camps in Xinjiang. And the United States, I think, is likely to soon impose economic sanctions on China over what they are doing in Xinjiang. So we're going to see that issue increase as well. The Chinese are, I believe, have really underestimated the Trump administration. They thought that they could find individuals who would be close to President Trump and sort of be able to whisper in his ear and give them something of what they needed, and put this relationship on a stable footing. But that has not worked. And the trade talks now, both sides are reluctant to say that they have failed. And I suppose there is some remote possibility that when President Trump meets with Xi Jinping in Japan at the G20 next month, that they could come to some understanding. But myself, I am really very skeptical that that will happen. The United States decision to put China on an entities list, essentially imposing export controls, is really a very major step. If you look at the Chinese press over the last few weeks, you will see a remarkable number of very authoritative commentaries coming out of China. It's clear that at the very highest levels, the Chinese leadership met after President Trump further increased the tariffs. He announced this through a tweet on May 5th, and decided that they have to dig in. And so we are really on the verge, I think, of an even more contentious relationship between the United States. There's been this debate in China about what U.S. intentions are. And again, as I said earlier, I think there is no uniformity in the administration about what our real vision and goal is. But the Chinese have debated, does the United States just simply want a better, even trading relationship, or does it want to contain China's rise? And China has always had this discussion inside and among their experts and their leaders about whether the United States wants to prevent China's reemergence as a great power. And I think increasingly that's the conclusion that they are reaching. If they have drawn that conclusion that the United States now seeks to contain China, then I think they're going to take the gloves off. There's been discussion in China just over the last few days about the possibility of trying to cut off U.S. access to rare earth minerals. So this could further elevate the competition. The Chinese have obviously no flexibility on sovereignty issues. This is something that is deeply linked to party legitimacy in China. And my own read is that under Xi Jinping, the understanding of sovereignty is changing in a way that might have negative implications for many countries that have sovereignty disputes with China. And I put that out there as something for you all to consider. They are really defining sovereignty in a way that gives them very limited, if any, room to maneuver in any future negotiations. Xi Jinping is in some ways a very strong leader, being in charge of so many leading small groups, for example. But I think at heart there is also a fragility that is in the system, and that Xi Jinping faces a lot of criticism over his mismanagement of relations with the United States, because the US being the sole superpower, China still needs to avoid a global confrontation, competition with the United States. And he's also criticized for mismanaging the economy. And nobody really knows how the Chinese economy is really growing. Many economists now say it's really closer to 3%, not 6% annual growth. But it's more than that. We have to dig deeper and look at the level of Chinese debt, for example, which I think is a source of great instability. So China will not change its economic structure. That is something the Trump administration is pushing for. This is the role of state-owned enterprises and subsidies. Their policies that seek dominance in critical technologies and greater self-reliance. These are things that Xi Jinping is certain about. But China is willing to gradually open up its market. It is willing to discuss reform of things like the World Trade Organization. But I think that this will probably not be enough for the Trump administration. I would highlight, however, that even though there's this competition that is going on, that there are some aspects of Trump's policies that are very beneficial to China's interests. The withdrawal of the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the fact that the United States is pursuing more protectionist policies. This has enabled China to portray itself as the champion of globalization, of trade liberalization, and of multilateralism. China looks pretty good to many countries around the world compared to the United States today. We have a president that regularly says disparaging things about U.S. allies. I think our alliances are one of the greatest sources of American strengths. Many countries around the world that we share common values with, and I think this has also provided China with an opening to improve its image around the world. So that is also something that they've, in a sense, benefited from. And I think more generally that Trump's policies have led many countries in this region and the broader sort of Indo-Pacific to become more skeptical of U.S. reliability and U.S. staying power. And that has led to more hedging and potentially even improvement by some countries in their relations with Beijing. So I think this has all been good for China. I could talk a little bit more about what's going on in the South China Sea. If you're interested, I'll just make a few comments. I think the United States continues to struggle with coming up with a strategy to really deter China from making further headway in controlling the South China Sea and advancing its sovereignty claims. There has been a regularization, as you know, of FONOPs, generally about every 8 weeks, although the last two were 2 weeks apart, and unclear exactly why that aberration took place. But interesting, maybe it's because it's in advance of the Shangri-La dialogue and the United States wants to show that it's more active in the region. But all of these FONOPs are part of a series that received approval at the outset of the Trump administration. So as you know, I'm sure the Pacific Command had been put on a very short leash when President Obama was in power, and the lawyers weighed every single freedom of navigation operation that they did to the point of their not being conducted very effectively. And that ended early on in the Trump administration. I think there's about 7 or 8 that had pre-approval, and the now Indo-Pacific Command can essentially conduct any one of these at a pace of about every 6 to 8 weeks. But I don't think that there's been any new FONOPs that they have sought approval for. So the U.S. focus has been on multilateralizing the operations in the South China Sea, and you've all seen many navies that have stepped up their activity. We've seen more by Australia, by Japan. There have been some joint exercises. The UK did a FONOP in the Paracels. There was a joint exercise by the US, Japan, Philippines, and India just last week. Fairly simple, but the US is looking for opportunities to present what is taking place in the South China Sea as not a U.S. versus China, but the countries that care about freedom of navigation and about rules of the road and tamping down friction from an American point of view to try to get all these countries together either bilaterally or minilaterally in various configurations to ensure that there's freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. I personally remain concerned that China has is in a consolidation phase. The Chinese tend to be pretty good at figuring out when they've pushed too far and they've irritated the region and they've lost some support, and then they pause and consolidate their position. And I see that that's what they're doing now, especially in the Code of Conduct talks. When the draft of the Code of Conduct was circulating, I'm sure many of you have seen it. It was to me surprising, but maybe it shouldn't have been surprising, that the Chinese inserted language that would essentially give China a veto over with the ability of any country in ASEAN to conduct a military exercise with a foreign military power, or the right of any country to conduct any drilling, any energy exploration with any other company from outside the region. But to me, this underscores China's ambitions in this region to weaken the involvement of outside powers, and particularly the United States, even though Xi Jinping keeps telling us that he doesn't want to push the United States out of the region. So I think essentially, if you look overall at the U.S.-China relationship, and I will just close with this, we really have, as I said, a strategic crossroads. It is possible yet to strike some kind of a deal. I think that it's probably not likely, but there is always a possibility that Xi Jinping and Trump decide that walking further down this road of tariffs and making essentially decoupling our economies are not that these efforts are not in the interests of the United States or China. So the president, in fact, has said at least twice publicly on the record that Huawei could be part of a trade deal. So I don't rule that out. President Trump is very transactional. He is very much of a businessman. He's not really a strategist. And so anything could be part of a deal. So I think that there is always a possibility that the negotiators come back to the table and find a way forward. I think from a political perspective, a good deal is really the best outcome for Trump. Because if there's a bad deal, he's going to get criticized. And let's remember, we're going into an election season in the United States. We already have 23 Democrats who have announced that they're running against Trump. And he is going to be criticized for his China policy. So if no deal is reached, he's criticized because he's made Americans suffer and he hasn't gotten anything for it. Or if he gets a bad deal, he's criticized. So the best outcome is really a good deal with China. So from a political perspective, that's why I think that I won't rule out that there could actually be a deal. But I would underscore that even if there is a deal, the U.S.-China relationship is going to remain contentious across a range of issues. China is going to be seen as threatening U.S. interests, and I just don't think that that's going to change. The other scenario, of course, is probably even worse. So hate to end on a negative note, but if there is no deal, the tariffs remain in place. We still have about $300 billion worth in goods that have not yet been put in under tariffs, and those could be put under 25% tariffs as well. There's currently an effort now to look at how to do that. China, of course, would then create more non-tariff barriers against American companies and look for other levers to use against the United States. areas where they have been reluctant to really hit the US too hard. I think ultimately they could decide to include those as well, and rare earths could be just the beginning. We're already seeing supply chains change, and those could really change permanently. US companies that are in China that are exporting, many of them are pulling out. More of them would pull out in the future. American companies that are selling to Chinese consumers would probably stay in China, so it wouldn't be a complete decoupling of our economies. We do 650 trillion billion in trade a year. We are not going to completely decouple our economies. So in this scenario, I think US-China relations would deteriorate across the board, and dialogue would be even further restricted. And the amount of dialogue, even today, military, diplomatic, economic, is so much less than it was under prior administrations, where we had so many different levels of institutionalized dialogue that is really no longer taking place today. So I think if that happens, China will try to limit the damage, but may opt to wait out Trump and hope for a Democratic president. Joe Biden, for example, our former vice president under Obama, has already said that he would pursue a different, he didn't say accommodating, but my word, more accommodating towards China. So the implications for other countries, I think, are pretty obvious. This scenario would lead to even more heavy pressure from the United States on other countries to limit their own economic involvement with China, whether it's Belt and Road or Huawei or limiting Chinese investment. I think we're already seeing that, but the US would double down on that. And there would be even greater, I think, pressure on countries to choose between the United States and China. I think that's a message actually China is sending as well, even though it's perhaps the language they use is that they're not forcing countries to choose, but my own view is that both the US and China are really putting pressure on countries to choose. And that means it makes it, I think, far more difficult for countries to defend their own strategic autonomy and their own interests. So maybe I will close by saying we should hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions, but I'm also happy to hear your own comments.
Please, gentlemen, ladies, if you would like to ask questions, introduce yourself and state where you're from. Thank you.
Sumati from Maritime Research Malaysia. So you spoke about the strategic competition which is clear between the US and China, and my focus is on South China Sea and freedom of navigation. US conducts regular freedom of navigation, and it is being constantly challenged and increasingly challenged by China. How does the US respond? Does the US employ UNCLOS as the first step to respond, or fuse, or the national laws or the US Navy's own SOPs, procedure of engagement or rule of engagement?
From my perspective, it looks like the United States is using a pretty consistent tool set to respond to what they see as China's challenges to freedom of navigation. It's just about sailing in international waters and, of course, within 12 nautical miles around features like Mr. Freeth, where China is not entitled to have a territorial sea, and challenging that claim. Including conducting military activities in those waters, which is something that the Obama administration did not do. But the United States is not seeking a military crisis or confrontation with China. I think that our military has had some pretty sharp discussions with China about the one FONOP that was, I think, I forget what month it was, maybe October last year, where the Chinese actually crossed the bow of a US ship. That was really dangerous. And that's not something that I think really serves U.S. or Chinese interests. My own view is that China doesn't benefit either from a military accident or crisis with the United States in the South China Sea. Many of us will remember the 2001 air collision that took place, and that was a political crisis more than a military crisis. But I think the ability of the U.S. and China to manage a crisis today is no better than it was then. We have hotlines that are in place now. But my confidence that the Chinese would pick up the phone and actually communicate with their counterparts still very, very low. I mean, this is a function of the Chinese system, not a function of China's level of confidence. So I don't see the U.S. doing anything different in the realm of freedom of navigation. What I do see is an effort by the United States to deter further Chinese actions. So that would be things like declaring baselines in the Spratlys, or announcing, an air defense identification zone. There's a lot of concern about the potential for China landing fighter aircraft or bombers in the Spratlys, which they have already done, as you know, in the Paracels. So I think the U.S. is basically trying to hold the line. And at the same time, the U.S. also wants to deter aggressive behavior against the other claimants in what we refer to as the gray zone area. So not by Navy ships, but by Coast Guards, law enforcement ships, and maritime militia. And so you may have recently heard, first it was our Assistant Secretary of Defense, Randy Shriver, who said this, and then our CNO, Richardson, Admiral Richardson, has stated something similar recently, that regardless of whether the hull is white or gray, that the United States is going to respond based on the mission that a vessel is implementing, and so that's a signal to the Chinese that the United States is not going to be deterred if it is engaged in aggressive behavior using something other than a Navy ship. But if we think about real contingencies, go back to the issue you raised of FONOPS, for example. If the Chinese use a Coast Guard vessel to interfere with a FONOP, I find it hard to believe that a U.S. Navy ship is going to deliberately ram a Chinese Coast Guard ship. This is just not in American interest. So it remains to be seen how this new policy will actually be carried out. So far, it's just rhetoric, and I haven't talked to anybody in the Pentagon who I think has really explained it. So I wonder how well thought out it really is. Yeah.
Captain History from Navy HQ. Actually, I have 3 questions. Can I? Short question. 3.
Okay, I may have to piece of paper. All right, go ahead. Maybe one at a time, but I'll try.
My first question is: do you think that Trump is going to win the second term?
Okay, I can remember that one.
This is like because for me, looking at all your presentation just now, it's seeing more and more to be all about inner politics. It's more and more about regime survival for the Trump, especially in regards to interpreting China, especially towards the business community, and for him to legitimize in the way in terms of performance legitimacy in the U.S. My second question is: I know that with regards to great powers, a minimal amount of systemic factors could influence your foreign policies. But don't you think that some re-emerging Russian factor, for example, that influence some of the relations with regards to U.S.-China? And my third question is, do you think that we are already in the middle of Second Cold War? Thank you.
Okay, start from the last one first. A lot of people do frame this as a Cold War. I myself do not, in part because when we use the term Cold War, those of us who lived through it, I was doing quite a bit of work early in my career on the US Soviet-Chinese triangle, strategic triangle and competition. And I'm very aware of what this Cold War was like. And of course we know, there was very little trade between the US and the Soviet Union, very little people-to-people exchanges. That's so totally different with China. So I'm ready to accept the fact, okay, maybe this is moving towards a new type of Cold War, but I don't like that frame because it makes people think about the tools that we used against the Soviet Union that are just not going to be relevant in dealing with China. So it's such a fundamentally different kind of strategic competition. We don't have comparable numbers of Chinese nuclear weapons, for example, aimed at the United States. We didn't have a sort of a Sputnik moment or the Cuban Missile Crisis. None of these things exist with China. And so I'm hesitant to use that frame because it really is fundamentally different. We'll be better positioned to deal with China, from my perspective, if we come up with a term that is unique, because I think this is a unique kind of strategic competition. Your second question, I think, is premised on the view that the United States is being irrational and that we would return to something rational. And there might be some irrational elements of President Trump's personal approach to China. But I think if from my interaction with people in the Trump administration on a broad range of issues, I don't sense that anybody is behaving irrationally. I was having a conversation with somebody last evening who raised this notion that the United States is weaponizing our economic competition with China. And my immediate reaction was, we are responding. It is China who is weaponized its economic challenges to the United States. And this is really very widely held in the United States. It's China who has actually pursued a set of policies designed at serving their own advantage and really to the detriment of the United States. And if you look at Xi Jinping's policy of civil-military fusion, which I really urge you to dig into, what's going on in the economic realm is not separate from their military capabilities. Everything in the economic realm is going to be applied where possible to gain new military advantages over the United States. And so this is strategic. I mean, the United States has woken up, and I don't think we're really being irrational, and I don't think we are really exaggerating the threat. Some individuals are, as I mentioned, this person in policy planning, it's not a clash of civilizations from my perspective, but I think that China's ambitions are first and foremost in this region. I think that they do want to have dominance. I think that they want to make sure that there is no country in this region that will challenge Chinese interests. Every decision that is made by any other country, Beijing expects that you will take Chinese interests into account, and most countries already do. When South Korea deployed THAAD, and they didn't take Chinese interests into account, they got punished, and they're still being punished. And this is a signal to every country in the region not to challenge Chinese interests. And of course, there are many other examples, the steps they took against the Philippines when, after the 2012 incident in Scarborough Shoal. So we can debate whether China has global ambitions. I myself don't think that China wants to supplant the United States as the sole superpower in the world. They may get there, but I just don't think that's their current plan. But there are some aspects of their global policies that we should be worried about. And global governance reform, which Xi Jinping has said China should be a leader in, I actually think is potentially problematic, because I don't like China's governance at home. And I think they're going to apply their governance at home to global governance. So another set of issues. The first question, we are 18 months away from the US election, so it's really difficult to predict. But if that election was held today, Trump would win. He has an enormously solid base of support in the United States. People who don't trust government, people who think that he's just willing to stand up for their interests, even though in fact in many ways he's harming them, like coal miners in the United States. He has really harmed their interests, or the farmers who are suffering from tariffs. But he's not going to be easy to beat. It is in part because of the way we do our elections, the electoral college system that has to win certain states. It may end up being close, but the biggest question, of course, is who will be the candidate that will run against him, and can that person actually beat him? I believe that Joe Biden, even though I think he's a nice guy, I just don't think that he's going to be able to beat Trump. And so far, I look at all of those 23 candidates, and nobody has emerged as somebody that is going to excite Americans to go to the polls. They need whoever that candidate is needs to mobilize women, Hispanics, blacks, I mean other minorities. People have to come out and vote. The youth, which was very, I think, inspired by President Obama, tends to stay home in most elections, frankly. So again, we have a year and a half, but right now, I would say that Trump's outlook looks pretty good. Yes.
Rahman from the Department of Science Intelligence. You used some very strong words in the deliberation just now. Words like containment, economic espionage, and a balance of power. So is the American administration fearing the rise of China to become a superpower? Number one. Number two, President Xi, under the new administration, has been declared as the president for life. And does that have any implication to the American policy against China? And thirdly, the trade war, in my reading, is an extension of trying to stop the BRI from happening. Thank you very much.
Well, I don't think President Trump sees the trade wars trying to stop the BRI. You know, it's fascinating if you listen to everything that Trump has said, if you read every one of his tweets, I don't think he's ever mentioned the Belt and Road. He certainly has never mentioned the South China Sea. I can tell you he has never raised it with Xi Jinping. It's hard for the Chinese to take us seriously that we're really concerned about what they're doing in the South China Sea when our president doesn't raise it. Certainly hasn't raised human rights. So I don't think, there may be other people in the administration who view the trade wars connected to other issues, but certainly our president doesn't. And it's not linked to security issues and security competition. And I see the Belt and Road as our intelligence community and our overall administration tends to view the BRI as a strategic plan that, you know, Xi Jinping has. I myself think that even if that exists in Xi Jinping's mind, it tends to be more chaotic and uncoordinated. But I think the administration views it as more coherent. The second question was, remind me?
President for life.
President for life. I'm not ready to conclude that Xi Jinping has made himself president for life. He has eliminated the term limits. But if he stumbles and there is opposition within the party, I do not rule out the possibility that there is a sort of momentum in the direction of forcing him to step down. It might not be after 2 terms, it might be 3. But I don't see him as a President Putin, for example. I don't think his position is quite that powerful. I think if you look at even the way that these trade negotiations fell apart, it tells us something about Xi Jinping. So despite the reporting on this. The United States, as I understand it, I've talked to people in the administration, they may be lying to me, I'll hold out that possibility, but I think that they're probably correctly saying that they have been clear with China about their demands from the very beginning, because we know they issued 140 demands in the economic realm, right? Their negotiating stance was leaked by the FT. So people at our US Trade Representative Office have told me that they didn't surprise China or increase the demands. What happened was, after the negotiations went on over 11 rounds, the US put 150 pages together. And that was translated into Chinese, and it went to the Politburo. And the overall language was seen by the Chinese as a threat to their dignity. More than anything else, that was the biggest concern, that China's dignity was being attacked. Xi Jinping couldn't sell it to the Politburo. So again, my conclusion is maybe he's just not quite as strong as some have said. That's not to say that there's currently any evidence of any opposition. I mean, I don't see any. But I just don't rule out the possibility that eventually he himself decides to step down, or the party just moves to have a new leader. The first question was about the tough language, containment, and espionage. China's been stealing technology from the U.S. for a long time. Espionage that is about, military technology and advantage, and in the intelligence realm, there's some rules of the road that I think most intelligence agencies that engage in this accept, and China just moved way beyond those rules of the road years ago. And in 2015, the one accomplishment that President Obama really made in this area was to get Xi Jinping to say that both countries would not steal intellectual property and use it for commercial advantage. So this may not be something that everybody believes, but based on my conversations, I believe this is something the US does not do. If a US company happens to obtain some information, they may do that, but we don't have our intelligence community stealing information and then saying, well, should we give it to Ford or Chrysler or which auto company? We just don't do that, and China does. And China made the same statement at the G20 and also bilateral to other countries like Germany, and they have not upheld it. And so I think that's really the biggest problem. It's about economic espionage. It's really about engaging in competition in a way that is beyond what is generally acceptable. And so I don't think that containment is necessarily the strategy that the Trump administration is pursuing. I think they're trying to compel China to engage in the rules of the road, to get back inside those boundaries, and compete in ways that are acceptable to the rest of the world, rather than just use things, methods like cyber espionage and other ways to gain really unfair advantage. And some of those areas of competition, it's disputable as to whether or not it's really outside of the rules of the road. So you take something like subsidies to state-owned enterprises. Well, I'm not a WTO expert, but it's difficult to prove that what China is doing is actually a violation of WTO rules. I mean, Germany had industrial policies that were very effective. How can we say that China can't pursue industrial policies? So this is the area where it's really difficult to come to any kind of compromise, because our economic growth model is just very different than China's, and China sees itself as its growth model as having achieved something. Let's remember Xi Jinping said at the 19th Party Congress that its model is something that other developing countries should learn from. So this is a success story, just as he cited what South China Sea is a success story. once Xi Jinping has made a statement like that, very difficult, I think, to walk back what they're doing. So I'm really not very optimistic about any real progress in that area. But I don't think the policy is containment. Yes?
I'm Kanong. So if we talk about this issue about rising of China, we have learned it from the past 15 to 20 years ago, but China is still rising, right? So like your presentation, you said during the Obama, there has a shift, pivot to Asia because of in the Middle East there is peace. So America can concentrate in the Southeast Asia, in the Asia. But now, with this problem with China, and at the same time, US having problem with Iran. So these two problems, do you think Americans still able to contain China, like you said? With the previous history happened? That is my question.
Well, even if we were not still focused on Iran and the Middle East, I think we wouldn't be able to contain China. I actually think the United States alone cannot contain China's rise. We would have to have the cooperation of some major powers in the world to, I think, really contain China's rise. So I don't think that's the US goal. It's about influencing China's behavior, trying to get China to change some of its most objectionable policies. But your question is very important because it goes to the heart of our strategy and our resource allocation. And if you look at our defense budget, even if it increases a small extent, you know, we're not going to have the size Navy that I think some people would like to have. We may increase a small number of ships. We will probably, even if you look at just to take one example, we're likely to pull out of the INF treaty. There's discussion about putting ground-based missiles somewhere in Asia. What country is going to host them? This is actually not an easy question to answer. So the US has a lot of challenges in this region, and we are still focused on the Middle East. Even during the period of the rebalance, you know, the US has never completely pulled out of the Middle East. An enormous amount of our defense resources are still focused on the Middle East. So I see this as a huge challenge for the United States. We are not equipped to conduct one war or two wars in two different theaters at the same time. Many people even doubt whether we can have one major war and then a small conflict in another theater. So I think the Chinese know that. But I also don't think the Chinese are particularly confident that they can take on the US even close to China's own coastline. So right now, I actually think that the risks of conflict are not very high. Accidents could happen, but I don't see us as having a major risk of conflict. But we're going to be focused in the Middle East for years to come. President Trump has clearly prioritized pushing back against Iran. I hope we don't end up in a war there. Yes?
From Navy HQ. US had a bad policy in the Middle East, which led to the Iraq war. So probably China is also engaging in the same bad foreign policy in South China Sea. So I think China sees it this way. If you can do it, I can do it. And probably US is taking China to task by saying that you are having some objectionable policies with regard to economy, for instance, with the 5G issues, for instance, with the IP issues, for instance. Why don't US engage China to solve these issues through WIPO or WTO, as you said?
I guess the short answer is that our president doesn't believe in multilateral institutions and dialogues with other countries. He wants a short-term solution. WTO reform would take years. I think we should start the process. China has put forward a proposal for WTO reform. The EU has also put forward a proposal. Nobody in the US is even thinking about it. But that is one thing that would change if we have a Democratic president, that there would be a recommitment to working with allies and partners around the world, because ultimately with a very strong China, as I said, the United States can just never really influence China's policies on its own. And in the economic realm, we now have other countries that are worried about China. And the concern about Huawei actually started in Australia, not in the United States. And there are many other countries, certainly among the Five Eyes, that are concerned about the implications of having Huawei in our networks. So this is not something that the U.S. can do on its own, but President Trump doesn't hold that view. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thomas from the Institute of Strategic and International Studies. Two things. You mentioned earlier about President Xi facing some sort of criticism for mismanaging the relations with the U.S. I wonder if you can elaborate on that. Is it a matter of mismanaging relations with the Trump administration and his team, or does it go a bit beyond that? The second point is a couple of days ago, the South China Sea and East China Sea Sanctions Act made a reappearance.
Yes.
I'm quite surprised to see it coming back, but then again, it shouldn't be. I wonder, how much of traction it's going to have this time. I mean, I know the environment seems very conducive for it, but it's also something that is rather detached from the trade aspect of the bilateral relationship. So I just wanted to have your comments on that. Thank you.
So the first question, I just forgot the first question. What was it?
You mentioned something about President Xi.
Oh yes, right, about being criticized. I hear this a lot from Chinese. They gripe about some of Xi Jinping's policies. Another one I didn't mention was the Belt and Road. There's a little bit less criticism of it now, but the entire first year, we had Chinese scholars that would come to Washington, D.C., who would talk about the risks of getting involved in the Belt and Road. They talk about Pakistan and how the security situation there was just so risky, and China was pouring all of this money in. So there's also been criticism of Xi Jinping's decision-making style. He makes decisions without bringing in a range of views, which, although China's not a democracy, has had its own version of what they call democratic centralism, and they have always had ways that they have incorporated different views, and as a result there's been some mistakes, things that have been said that had to almost be corrected later on, and this is particularly true in their policy toward Taiwan, which I follow closely, but I know that his 19th Party Congress political report was not as widely circulated and did not get the input that Party Congress reports usually do. So as far as criticism of the policy towards the United States, I think it does go beyond Xi Jinping's failure to find the right person who can whisper in Trump's ear. It's been an underestimation of Trump's willingness to impose tariffs. I mean, from the very beginning, the Chinese really didn't believe that we were going to go through with it. And now their recent decision to not go forward with the trade agreement in the last round. And by the way, the version that we got back from the Chinese apparently had 1/3 of the document crossed out. I mean, we're not just talking about a few pages. It was literally 45 pages that had been redlined. So that really, I think, suggests that the Chinese thought that they could get away with this, that the U.S. would remain in the negotiations, rather than to pull out and then go to launch a war against Huawei. I just don't think they correctly have predicted what President Trump would do, and I think that's what he's really being criticized for. Now I've forgotten your second question.
It's about Marco Rubio's...
Marco Rubio's legislation. I'm not surprised to see it come back, but I'm skeptical it will pass in its current form. If you read it closely, we have in Congress certain kinds of language that's used if it's binding on the president or if it's just a recommendation of what the president has to do. And in most administrations, the executive branch does not want Congress to have too much power in foreign policy, and so they usually resist language that says that the president shall do this or the State Department shall do that. And almost the entire bill uses that language. So it's not just the fact that it would impose sanctions on Chinese companies, but it's dictating to the administration as to what they have to do. And I think that there will be some pushback. And we'll have to see how the House of Representatives reacts, and if they go into conference. I don't even know if it will get that far. But I wouldn't be surprised if it passes in some form. There is ongoing frustration about how to influence China's behavior in the South China Sea. And in the Obama administration, they considered imposing sanctions on Chinese companies that were conducting the land reclamation, the dredging, and of course the militarization activities. This bill has some language that I find a little bit too expansive, so it even includes the building of lighthouses. How can we object to the building of a lighthouse? But the militarization activities, I think, again, we're looking for sort of scrambling for how to influence China's behavior. And I think when I talked to one journalist, I used the expression, it's like, letting the horse out of the barn after the door is open. I mean, we should have done this if we were going to do it. We should have done it 4 years ago when they first started the dredging. We might have had an impact on China's behavior at that time. In my view, this is really almost too little too late. I'm not really sure. Again, if you have to ask the question, what's the goal? What do you really expect to achieve? And I doubt that we're going to deter China from landing fighter jets or bombers on their airstrips in the Spratlys because we're saying we're going to impose economic sanctions on some of their companies. But it's interesting that they're trying again. We'll see how far it gets and in what form it passes if it finally does. Yes?
It's really interesting how you begin. At the beginning, I thought you were against Trump. To be honest.
It's not so simple.
And towards the end, now you
She's a Republican.
No, actually, I'm an independent, registered as an independent.
I won't go into that, but I'm beginning to understand in a way like it's very interesting on how this has developed. I'm probably one of the few people in this part of the world that say Trump, I know he's a brilliant guy, very smart, and it's just interesting how when he first came into administration, he against the idea of military in the Middle East, and I think he still keep that promises. And I don't see him talking directly on military deployment, just like how you had said it too, which is good. But just that he's behaving like a general in terms of economics, and which have more impact on people. So, and I think that is what probably America needs to deal with now, is because before these people would not want things to escalate, especially in South China Sea. But because all those things that those hard military maneuvers actually happened during Obama's time. Your deployment of Marine in Australia, that really was an eye-opener on that. But somehow there's no more of this, except recently with the Quad thing. coming to be. And you had this exercise with the Philippines and probably soon with Vietnam passing through. Then again, it's for safety, as you said.
It's just freedom of navigation, yeah.
But this tough economic policy, the problem it has impact on normal people, not people like us here. We just concerned about security,
But they're linked, they're inextricably linked.
So I think it'll be I don't know, it'll be a tougher time for America because people would just say that, they would just say, wow, Americans are just jealous. It's just that, So I don't know, but how are you guys going to deal with that? Now you are dealing with the normal. But before the people just judging America just by your military action, which is I would say a fair thing to there was a hard policy military deployment that happened in the past. But now it's the economy issue. And then you're talking about jobs, losses of jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And you have rightfully put it, the suffering, Americans suffer too.
Mm-hmm.
So how is this gonna benefit? Well, I know for sure that Trump will get his second term. No doubt. No doubt. I can put my money
We'll
on
see.
that, So how is all this that which group of people in America that's really behind the president? That's interesting. I'd like to know.
Yeah, such I appreciate your thoughts, so thank you. Just to say a little bit more about my views, and then I'll answer your question. I consider myself somebody who doesn't fit in a box very easily. I'm not a Republican or necessarily a Trump supporter. But having spent my whole life studying China, I am concerned about some of China's policies. And I particularly urge you to look into the civil-military fusion effort. Many of the things that Xi Jinping is pushing, I think are quite worrisome, not just for China's neighbors, not just for the United States, but for international order and for the future of security globally. And I think we're really just at the beginning of that. And I still believe that there can be ways to influence Chinese policies. And so what I object to is most of Trump's policies. His administration, I think, does have, in some areas, a better understanding of what the challenges are that China poses. In some areas, I disagree with him. As I said, Belt and Road, don't think I see it as quite as much of a threat as they do. There are, in fact, it may end up being almost a lodestone, something that really prevents China from having more positive influence. There are other aspects of China's strategy and the nature of the way that they define the threat that I don't completely agree with. But I believe that the Obama administration was maybe we'd say asleep at the wheel, was not completely really focused on how China was emerging, which really, to my mind, goes back to over a decade ago. You can trace the origins of these policies to Hu Jintao. They're not all created by Xi Jinping. So I think there is a need to better understand China's ambitions and China's strategy and to find new ways to influence it. And I'm not happy about the tariffs or the trade war, but they've gotten China's attention in that regard. That's not a bad thing. But I don't think we should engage in a strategy that will harm the US economy or harm the global economy, because that's where we're headed. This is not just about harming China. Your question about sort of, the Trump supporters, there's a book that I'm not sure if it's still on the bestseller list, but I just finished reading it because it was recommended to me by somebody. It's called Hillbilly Elegy. And it's written by somebody who lived in, he grew up in a very, very poor area of Kentucky. And people who live there and have a certain culture and lifestyle are referred to as hillbillies. And these are people who were very, very poor, found that the American dream was never attainable for them. They live in families that are usually broken, a lot of alcoholism, a lot of drug addiction, a sense of that the lives that they have, that their children will not even have what they had, that every generation is not having a better chance to succeed, but worse. So a real sense of negativism about their future. And this book is really seen as explaining to many people why President Trump won, that he tapped into the growing negativism in the United States, that people felt that Washington wasn't working for them, that all of the people who come from the system, and certainly people like Hillary Clinton, who was a US Senator and the wife of a former US President, would never be able to make their world better, to help them have opportunities. And President Trump talked about giving these people hope, and they believed him. Whether they will continue to believe him, I think, is still questionable. But there's a lot of people in America who feel left behind. And so you have a lot of these, the heartland. If you ever look at the election map in the United States, in the center, it's all red. They're all diehard supporters of Republicans. So it's mostly about domestic issues. They don't really care very much about foreign policy, although when President Trump says China stole our jobs, they say, yeah. And one thing that the author writes about is that these kind of people are never willing to take responsibility themselves and try to better themselves. They prefer to blame others. And so this is something that resonates with them when President Trump says it's about China. I was like, oh, of course, we'll blame China. We'll blame the former US presidents. Rather than to say we ourselves need to make our own circumstances better. Anyway, the author became a lawyer. He went to Yale Law School, the first person in his family to ever go to college, and then, of course, to go on to law school. So he's, anyway, helped me to sort of get better insights into what's going on in America. But as a person who lives outside of Washington, D.C., inside what we call the Beltway, this is not something that, is really easy for me to understand. So thank you very much. Yes?
We all know that China steals a lot of information and intellectual properties. Then they make a lot of imitation goods too. Not only against America, but all over the world. Companies suffered because of their copycats. But why America is taking it against a company while instead of the country? And the second question, in trade war with China, who is going to suffer more?
I'm not an economist. There was a great article in Bloomberg I was reading the other day that had some graphs showing the likely impact of prolonged tariffs if they remain in place and if they continue to go up on the US economy and the Chinese economy and then on the global economy. And it estimates the percentage of GDP growth that would decline over a period of something like 10 years. And so you can see how China and the US both get hit pretty hard, but China apparently the prediction is would get hit worse. So it could go as high to something like 0.7 or 0.8% decline in GDP growth as a result of tariffs. And I think for the US it may have been probably maybe half that. But then the global economy ends up getting hit too. So I think it's very difficult to make these kind of predictions because there's so many variables in my view. So I don't know. Ultimately, everybody suffers. Some countries suffer more than others. So you take like South Korea, you take Taiwan, they are going to suffer enormously because they're just right in the center of these supply chains. And it's not easy for them to disassociate themselves from Chinese companies that they're working with really closely. So some countries are going to get hit, I think, much harder than others. I think that in the long term, China's not going to collapse from the tariffs, but whether pressure on China economically would end up causing more criticism of Xi Jinping and leading to some political change there. I mean, that's always an interesting question. We can throw out our leader too if we blame him for the tariffs, but it's a little different in China how that would play out. What was the other question?
Why did America take it against?
Oh, right. Why did America? You know, it's a question I don't have the answer to because there was a moment early on. This was in 2017 when the United States was considering imposing sanctions on the Chinese company ZTE. And that company would have gone out of business if the United States had gone through with that threat. And Xi Jinping asked President Trump to not proceed with those sanctions. And President Trump agreed. I'm sure he thought that by giving this gift to Xi Jinping that he would get something in return. I think we expected it was something that was related to Qualcomm and its market access in China, and the United States didn't get anything. But some people thought, boy, that was a missed opportunity. You know, I had this company, a stranglehold, and we let it go, we let it live. To this day, I really don't understand what President Trump was really thinking. But Huawei is the biggest symbol of China's success. And if we just go after their failure to protect intellectual property, we've been doing that for years, frankly. We've been in dialogue with China for more than 10 years about IP protection. We fear we won't get anywhere. Now, in the negotiations and in this 150 pages of text, there's a lot of things that China has or had agreed to do to protect intellectual property. So it's very much a priority. But the focus now is on this, it's this symbol of Chinese success and Chinese power that the United States apparently wants to show you're not quite as powerful as you thought you were. Huawei is trying to build up their capabilities to produce semiconductors, and there are other Chinese companies that are trying to ramp up their domestic ability to produce semiconductors. But China right now produces, I think, maybe 15% of the demand for semiconductors. And if they can't get access to the machinery that is necessary to produce it, which is only produced by the United States and Germany, then they won't be able to ramp up that supply. And so this is, we are really entering into sort of the heart of this competition. And Huawei posed an opportunity. And it was, I think that there was a Wall Street Journal article a couple of days ago, which is worth looking at, that has the story about how Australia conducted a simulation. And they concluded, as part of this simulation, that Huawei posed an enormous threat to their security. And they brought this information to the US and to other Five Eye partners. So the origin of this, real increase in US concern and decision to go after Huawei is in part due to Australia. So there's a shared sense that Huawei has the ability to gain access to systems that other companies don't. And if you read China's intelligence law, their national security law, it's very clearly written that the Communist Party can go to any company, any Chinese company, and demand that they turn over their data. And Ren Zhengfei, who is the CEO of Huawei, said, oh, we would never do that. Well, why should anybody believe him? So this is really seen as a security threat. And again, not just by the United States, but by Australia, now by New Zealand. Countries are trying to position themselves in a way where they will not completely offend China. And Huawei is a good company, and they have cheap equipment, and it's advanced technology. Many countries are already so deeply invested that the cost involved in pulling Huawei technology out of those systems would be enormous. And countries don't want to lose the next 2 to 3 years of opportunity of developing 5G, waiting for other companies to catch up. And there's many European countries who have that view. Even certainly the UK in their recent decisions, I think the Germans remain concerned. They do not want to give up having 5G technology, and they will get it sooner if they have Huawei. But the bigger question is they don't want to offend China. So every country has to navigate this path differently. How can they maintain a fairly amicable relationship with China, get the benefits of having some kind of cooperation with China, while also protecting their own security and maintaining good relations with the United States. So I'm sure Malaysia has its own set of problems and challenges in that area.
I will offer you to ask questions to any of us if you want to.
Well, I would be interested in hearing your perspective on what the United States is doing in the South China Sea. Is it helpful? Is it harmful? What should the U.S. be doing that it isn't doing?
I think your presence in the South China Sea, to the Chinese mind, is provocation.
But how does Malaysia look at it?
We, as an interested party in the overlapping claims, obviously feels that there is a necessity to put a check and balance on the China's adventurous activities. On a part of China, they look at provocation that you have been doing in the area, and you have included India from the other side of the globe into the South China Sea. Okay? So that provocation can turn in the open seas into an incident and an accident which all of us would not dream of and would not like to happen. Seriously.
So you'd like to see fewer navies operating in the South China Sea rather than more?
The debate is how much do we want? As you said, they did it 6 to 8 weeks, now they do it twice in the month of May. Why? That is provocation to the Chinese mind.
Oh, I know how China sees it. I'm just interested in how Malaysia sees it. I talk to the Chinese a lot.
You're talking to a Chinese now.
Okay.
My DNA is Chinese.
Okay, your DNA is Chinese. I appreciate that.
Thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Yes. Okay.
I'm more concerned on, about I'm very passionate about the ADMM plus
Mm-hmm.
mechanism. You're familiar with it, I believe, right? So, I tend to be personal about it because, when I say probably, my career was in ASEAN day. And I personally be very, I would say, very unhappy if that mechanism I would not be in the center of this.
Mm-hmm.
So I really believe this ASEAN is central in this thing, and we already, we've come a long way, establishing something like the ADMM Plus, and under undermining that mechanism to me personally, I would say it's a disaster. Because it's very critical, because now we meet every year. It's the only forum we get, you know. It's the only superpower, the US, and then riding power, China. And you can always bring this to the table. So I think you're very right to go around there, you know, free of navigation. They believe in the law of the sea. But this mechanism is where I think the difficult debate should take place. Let it be open. There are 18 countries there, 10 ASEAN, plus our dialogue partners, who are some allies to you. And let's bring it on there. And we're already having mechanisms like the expert working group on maritime security. So it's just a matter of time now. I think what probably frustrates the Americans is that we've been doing too much of the non-traditional aspect of security, you know, which is, I think, it bores you guys still, talking about terrorism and all that. Because your focus is very traditional. It's, you know, potential flashpoints, that kind of thing. And that's what been, somehow ASEAN likes to, let's rub this slowly and surely. So I believe one day we will get to do all this difficult, sensitive, traditional exercise. We did it before. You know, for the first time back in 2014, 2013. We had major exercise, 18 countries in, you know, just off Brunei water. So you give ASEAN time, we eventually get there. And that's how you should contain China. Out in the, you know, very, very open, which everyone has a say. Yeah. Because we can be very blunt, and the ADMM Plus, you should join them one day, you know.
Yeah, it's good advice.
Discuss it. Because the military, they're very sensible.
Yes.
We can be very direct. We're not like diplomats, we don't know what we're talking about. But, so I think the ADMM Plus mechanism, you shouldn't undermine that. It's really critical. So I'm very concerned of your Indo-Pacific strategy, because somehow I feel like, you know, there'll be some kind of division, might, you know, over the years. That's a worry. And you're facing a guy who's, you know, basically from the beginning of ADMM Plus, I've been largely involved, and I think, you know, so long as I remain in MINDEF, I think that policy will not go away from Malaysia.
You know, the most important part of the rebalance to Asia under Obama was the focus on Southeast Asia. That was really what was new about the US approach to the region. And there were a lot of, although many disappointments in terms of, I think, lack of resources, for example, but there were things that the United States did, becoming a member of the East Asia Summit and participating in ADMM Plus exercises and creating US-ASEAN summits. There were a lot of things that the Obama administration did. And I fear that the Trump administration is, to some extent, paying more sort of lip service to Southeast Asia. It took a while for them to even say that they would, that they still believed in ASEAN centrality. This is also true of Japan. When Prime Minister Abe started talking about the free and open Indo-Pacific, there was no ASEAN centrality, right? So it's understandable that I think the region here feels that maybe it's being overlooked a bit, and there needs to be much more engagement and emphasis on these multilateral activities. And ADMM Plus is certainly very central to the region. I think there's a view that any kind of military exercises with China now should be avoided. That's probably not a good approach. You know, we disinvited China from RIMPAC because of their activities in the South China Sea. And I doubt that we're going to look for those kind of opportunities in the future, but maybe ASEAN can pull the US back into at least exercising multilaterally within the ADMM Plus, because I think that's the only opportunity to do that. Even the recent fleet review in China, the US didn't send any vessels. So there really is this almost sort of allergy now to doing anything with the Chinese military, except sitting down in a dialogue about crisis communications or preventing real misunderstanding or escalation, which is, I think, disappointing, because there had been positive engagement we used to have with China, more military exercises we used to do, and I think we should never underestimate the impact of that professional interaction of military officers. There used to be so much more of it than there is today. Yeah.
I think I remember Secretary Carter back in 2015 in Shangri-La, he mentioned on regional mechanism how the US would really work together with the existing regional mechanism. So that's why when there's this shift, I find it really alarming. It would be a shame if US will, would not have that belief towards ADMM Plus anymore.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Yep.
For me, I think you have stated it earlier. Before we see it, for example, FONOP as different from US-China strategy. But now it is FYP, for example, we see it as under US-China strategy. So I think that's the dilemma for us. To say that we need more, we need less. So that's a dilemma that, and as you state, that we are in that middle of balancing or accommodating a spectrum, hedging, for example, as you are saying. So to see that FOIP or the operation that they are conducting is under that US-China strategy, that is give us a dilemma in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So
Thank you. I agree with that. I'm sure many countries also see that as problematic. Yes.
Sorry, I'll just give a personal opinion.
Yes.
I think in countries like Malaysia, rightly or wrongly, when you talk about the US and the South China Sea, people associate it with FONOPS and nothing else.
Yep.
Now, I think you are going to find people here who believe that FONOPS just makes things worse for the rest of the claimant states. Not for you guys, but for us. Because China gets more aggressive, it starts placing more assets, and it impacts us more than you. But on the other hand, it's a real conundrum, like actually as you said. So on the other hand, the only country that has the capability to go out there to confront China in the way in a meaningful way, the only country that China would probably pay any real attention to is the United States. So again, it's a real mixed bag. I've been to discussions where people really argue passionately both ways, and it's an argument that goes throughout Southeast Asia. My bigger concern is the perception of folks in DC, and especially in the Navy and in PACOM, towards how the claimant states in Southeast Asia react and present their views, especially on Chinese recognition activities. I've had the privilege of interacting with folks on PACOM quite a bit, both here and in Hawaii, and maybe I'm overstating things, but in a lot of conversations with officers who are preparing to go up to the flag rank, so these are captains and guys with more stuff. After a while, once you break through the formalities of conversation, there's a sense that, look, the Americans are there, we are there, we're doing all these things, we're confronting China, and we know that you don't have the assets to do it. But at the very least, when we ask you for a statement of support, or when these things happen, right? You say absolutely nothing. When China increases its presence in the South China Sea, you don't say anything meaningful at all. So why the hell are we there doing all this for? It's a sense of it's just a sense from the conversations that I'm getting. and I'm just worried that it can permeate and go beyond that.
That's interesting. I hope more people hear that message here. I think there is a sense of frustration in the U.S. We don't expect other countries or the claimants to do everything that we're doing. And we understand even outside powers have limits. So if Japan were to, for example, go inside 12 nautical miles around a feature, Chinese Navy ships would probably go inside 12 nautical miles around the Senkakus, and that's a price I don't think they should pay. There's less patience and understanding as to why the Australians won't do it, right? So we continue to put pressure on them. But those who are in this region, at a minimum, I think there is a desire to have countries speak out a little bit more in support of what the U.S. is doing in its FONOPs, to call out China when they do something that's destabilizing. But as somebody who spent a lot of time in the region, I mean, I understand why countries feel that there's an enormous price that they would have to pay for doing so. But then the perception in the United States is that everybody's just free riding on us, right? So, but at the end of the day, enforcing freedom of navigation, although there is a major focus on the South China Sea, it's global, right? I mean, if we lose the access to be able to have military ships sail inside EEZs, that's a loss for navies everywhere and for all countries. So it is, as you know, goes back to the late 1970s, the whole FONOP program, but there is also a sense this is a litmus test. If China wins in the South China Sea, if it gains the effective control that it wants, if it forces countries in this region to make compromises and maybe even give China back what the Chinese claim is rightfully theirs, not a good outcome, I think, that anybody would like to see, that this will feed China's appetite. The Chinese will see this as a huge win. If they can get away with establishing, for example, baselines in the Spratlys and ADIZ, I think it would cause a lot of friction with countries in this region. But then again, maybe eventually countries say, well, U.S. not a reliable partner, isn't really effectively influencing China, so maybe we just have to find our own accommodation. And so that's what, not hearing, as you refer to, words of support from the region, that's what it raises the specter in the minds, I think, of people in the United States, that that's the outcome we're going to face, and that countries in this region don't realize that that's where they're headed. And so, yes, we'd like to hear more and see more in terms of activity that signals to China that nobody wants to see China dominate this region. So thank you very much.
So distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our session this morning. So we'd like to extend our heartfelt appreciation to our speaker as well as distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind presence and contribution here today. Thank you very much.